Tune into this episode of the DevOps Lab, where myself and Nikita talk about Azure Load Testing. And this time, Nikita's going to show us how to integrate it into your GitHub Actions workflow. So tune in. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the DevOps Lab. We're back again with Nikita. Welcome back, Nikita.
Hi, April. Thanks for having me again.
I'm so happy to have you back. So today you're going to take us through something really cool with Azure Load Testing and GitHub Actions, right?
Yes. So we over the last 1 year since Azure Load Testing has been in public preview, we've seen customers using Azure Load Testing and integrating into their CI/CD pipeline. They feel that it's very important that every time you have like a major release and in your deployment cycle, it's important for them to test in a say a pre-production environment and make sure that things are fine before they promote the release into their production environment. So it's very important to integrate load testing into your CI/CD pipelines, and GitHub Actions is one way to do it. And today I'm going to take you through how you can do it with GitHub Actions.
Awesome. I mean, load testing is such an important part of the application deployment process, right? We don't want to just go to production without testing what our apps are doing. So yeah, Nikita, take it away.
So I'll show you how you can do this. This is first of all, this is a .NET podcast application that we are going to test. It's a simple web application which has a lot of podcasts. You can discover what podcasts are there. You can click on podcasts. You can listen to them, and there are a bunch of podcasts you can go through. So this is the one we are going to load test today. But I have enabled some access restrictions on the web app, and there's one version of this which has not, which is not accessible through a public internet. So this can be only accessed from a virtual network. So today we are going to do private endpoint testing, and I'm going to show you how to do that in GitHub Actions. So this is our web app. Let's go to the source code for this application. So this is my .NET podcast application, and I have all my code for the .NET podcast app here. But there's a folder here, which is a test folder. As you can see, these are all my files that I require for my load test. Now I'll take you through what all these files are. But it's as simple as having everything version controlled. And that's the beauty of it. Like you can always keep track of what changes were made.
Absolutely. And I think that's why we want to do it, right? We have a really good CI/CD process using GitHub. We can source control over our files. Plus, if someone changes that testing file, we can see that commit change in our source control as well.
Yes, exactly. So you can version control your test plans, your config files, and your input data files, everything that you need for you to load test, and you can track back what were the changes made over time. So as you can see here, there are different files. First of all, the ARM template is the way you would manage your infrastructure. So the resource that you require for load testing, you can use the ARM templates here to create those and manage those over time. Now we have our JMeter script that I have written for this podcast application. Let me just take you through the JMeter script. So it's a simple script which load tests 4 pages: the podcast page, the home page, the discover page, and the search page. As you can see, we also have a CSV data input configured for this. And we also use a custom function, which is basically a way for you to extend the core functionality of Apache JMeter. So I've used a custom function here, which just grabs the environment variable. So this is what we have. Now, all the files that are needed to run this JMeter script are in my test folder here. As you can see, the JMeter script is here. You have the CSV data file. You also have the jar file for the custom function that is required to run the custom function that we have in our JMeter script. Now, there's also one thing called the config YAML. Now, this is where you define all your configuration for your load test. And this is the config as code methodology that we use. So we have a YAML file, which you can we can just go through the YAML file and see what it has. So you can configure all the settings for your load test in this YAML file.
Awesome. Now to generate that YAML file, I have a love-hate with YAML. So can I generate that YAML file from an example somewhere? I mean, you'll share this repo with everyone so they can have access to this as well, some of your testing scripts.
Yes.
But like, how do I generate this YAML file?
So this YAML file, you have all the docs which have sample YAML files. But one cool thing is that if you've run a test from the portal, you can always go and download the YAML file from there. So we auto-generate the YAML file. You can just download it and check into your repo. It's as simple as that.
That's really easy. So I can configure it in the portal, know what I'm doing because it'll be the first time I'm doing it, export that out, put that in my GitHub repo, and then I have that repeatable YAML file that I then can know what I'm actually doing with it. Awesome.
Yes. Yeah.
Cool.
So let's go through this, right? You just have a couple of inputs like what is your test ID that you would have run in your portal that you want to rerun again from GitHub Actions. The display name, what the test plan, which is basically the JMeter script. Engine instances is how many engines you want to run your load on. And then you have the file paths to your configuration file. So all the other files apart from the JMeter script go here, like the jar file, the CSV file. This allows you to also split the CSV across the engines so that you have unique rows for all engines. Now we also have something called environment variables. You remember the custom function that we used. So we can set your environment variables here. So this is my web app, and this is the URL for my web app that I'm testing. I've provided that as an environment variable. Now this web app also requires a certificate for authentication. So I've just provided the name of the certificate, and this is my Azure Key Vault certificate URL that we have. You can just provide that here. Remember when we said that it's a private endpoint that we're testing and not a public one? So you can just say, what is your subnet ID? Just provide the subnet ID resource ID here, and you are just good to go. Now, one very important thing in a CI/CD pipeline is to set some failure criteria, because you wouldn't want not so good build to go into your production when it is not passing certain thresholds, right?
True.
So you can set some thresholds here. For example, for the podcast page, I have set saying that my 90th percentile of my response time should not be greater than like 10,000 milliseconds, right? So you can set thresholds, and what we do is we evaluate these thresholds at the end of the test, and the GitHub action either fails or passes based on the evaluation of these failure criteria. So that allows you to take action based on whatever the result of the GitHub action was. So that's one way of you to stop the test, stop the build from going into production when it does not meet the performance criteria that you have.
That's great. No, that makes a lot of sense. Being able to put that failure criteria into that YAML file so that when you test it, because a lot of times we'll say, oh, it was good enough, or we proceed, or we're under time pressure, right? So having that failure criteria is great. That means we can see that performance. And if it doesn't meet that, whether we're meeting an SLA, or I know a lot of customers work in like seasonal ups and downs or scalability, we can see that criteria met before we proceed to the next stage in our deployment.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, what are we waiting for? Let's take a look at what the GitHub action file, the GitHub workflow file looks like, right? So it's a very simple workflow. This is a workflow that I've written for specifically for load testing. So as you can see, you just log into Azure, and then this is the part where you manage your infrastructure. So basically, you can just create a resource group and then create an Azure load testing within this. This is a standard ARM template deployment. Once you have your resource created, this is where you actually run the load test. So this is a simple action which expects the config file that we've seen just some time ago, and your load test resource and the resource group that you would like to run the load test on. So these are the minimum inputs that you had to provide, and you can just run the workflow. We also export the results of the load test back into your workspace. So you can always download those results from the folder and then upload it as an artifact onto your workflow. So this is how the workflow file looks. Let's go ahead and run this. So this is my podcast load test workflow, and I just say run workflow.
And this is manually triggered, I guess, obviously for the purpose of this, but if you have a automatic workflow file that maybe every time the infrastructure changes, you've added that GitHub action to that workflow. So you can automate the whole process. But yeah, for demo purposes, obviously it's manual to show that. But yeah, maybe every time an infrastructure change happens or there's a deployment, it then runs. So we can automate that maybe with a push to the main branch or changing code, any kind of commit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's what you would want to do in a real situation where you'd like to do it for every, say, push to your main branch or every merge that is happening, right? So GitHub Actions gives you that flexibility of basically configuring those triggers.
Absolutely. And if you're an organization that works off of, maybe you're really busy at a certain time of day, you can actually run the load test off a scheduled job. So you can run that action to say that workflow file to say run every day at 9 a.m. because that's your heavy, that's an hour before your heaviest use case, or that is your heaviest. So that's always good to run those things as well. Maybe you need it at certain times of day as well. So cool.
As you can see, this workflow has kicked off and it's running. Since it might take some time to run, I'll take you through a previous run that we had. Yeah, so as you can see, my previous run that I ran a while ago had failed. So let's go and see what happened and why did it fail.
Okay.
Yeah, so you see, this is our Azure Load Testing task that we have here, and this has failed. And that's why the workflow has failed as well. As you can see, the test started running fine. And then you know how to navigate into your portal to see this test. And the test run completed. You have the summary of the test. But looks like the test criteria that I had set did not pass. Like one of the criteria, the podcast page actually failed. So I see the podcast page, I see all the response time for each of the pages that I was load testing. And the test result was failed because one of the criteria failed, right? And that's why we failed this action, and which also fails the workflow. So this notifies me that something is wrong, and maybe I'll have to make some changes and maybe run the test again. But you can always go into your portal and see. So this is my test run that I had run. As you can see, the test result is failed, and you have more insights that you can see here, right? You get all the visualization that you want. You can also add server-side metrics. So you can say configure app components, and I can see.
So we can get a full view. So we can see why it failed in terms of the development phase. And then we can go into the portal, get more details, find out where these dependencies are failing. Again, we talked about this in the first video as well about Azure Load Testing when you went really in depth with it. And you're going to show us now how all the applications come together and we can pinpoint exactly where that failure point is.
Exactly. So as you can see, I've added my application components, and you can monitor like what exactly had happened. I can see that memory was a little high for app service, but I also see that the SQL Server really, the CPU percentage really hit 300% plus, right? It just kept on increasing. So I can just go dig deeper and see where is my bottleneck, what can be improved. Does it have to be a code change, or does it have to be an infrastructure change, and then decide what steps can be taken to improve the performance of my application.
Awesome. Nikita, that's great. It's great to be able to see how we can integrate Azure Load Testing into our pipelines, especially with GitHub Actions. We can fail the pipeline so nothing affects production or other environments. We can see our apps, how they're performing. This is fantastic. Thank you so much for showing us this.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining. And we'll see you again on the DevOps Lab.